I'm Peter Kernahan. I'm from Marling School and I'm here with Dr. Martin Wood from the University of Gloucestershire. And we're talking about Buddhism. Already in the earlier videos we've gone through the life of the Buddha and the Four Noble Truths and the texts, the Pali texts and Mahayana texts. We're looking now at the tradition of Theravada Buddhism. What does the word Theravada mean? And tell us a little bit about what the tradition is and where it came from, Martin.
In Pali, I pronounce it Theravada. Theravada is perfectly acceptable as well. It is understood to be the way of the elders. It's one of the earliest schools of Buddhism. And I'm stressing that for a specific reason, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Yes. But it's one of the earliest schools of Buddhism, which were entitled, perhaps somewhat derogatorily, the Hinayana, or the small vehicle. However, it has survived as Theravada down to the modern days. Its geographical spread is largely throughout Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, Burma, Myanmar, Thailand, all of which these countries can actually trace their beginnings back to India, Third Council, Ashoka. I won't go into too much detail there. However, what it was largely, the success of Buddhism in these areas was largely down to the endorsement and the adoption of Buddhism by the ruling elite, as it were. So, for example, in Thailand, the king became known as the Dharma Raja, the protector of the Dharma and the Sasana, the Buddhist tradition. And as such, the canonical texts, the integrity of the Sangha, the orthodoxy, the doctrinal purity, the hierarchical
So it's wrong to say this is orthodox Buddhism, this is the original Buddhism, to equate Buddhism with Theravada?
I'm not going to suggest at this point that orthodox is a particularly helpful term to use. However, I would say that Theravada Buddhism is very, very conservative doctrinally. And it is considered that very, very little has changed since its inception. However, maybe if I talk a little bit more about exactly what the key understandings of Theravada are. They conceive salvation, liberation as it were, as the eradication of greed, the eradication of hatred, of delusion. They don't suggest that this is a closed possibility. It is open to everybody. But it is ultimately, this liberation is for Theravadins the only thing that's worth attaining. And that actually brings it into contrast with later Buddhist traditions.
What do Buddhist scholars like Gombrich say about Theravada then?
I think what Gombrich is largely talking about in his works is that he sees Theravada Buddhism, I think, certainly as the orthodox expression of Buddhism, and that's something that we can talk about in a second as well. But what he also does is he understands the nature of religion on one level. This question of orthodoxy that we came up with. I mean, prior to the development of the Theravada tradition, there was anything between 16 and 18 different other Buddhist traditions which were in existence. For example, the Pagladavadins. Earlier traditions eventually would have influenced...
This is in the 300, 200, 100 BC
around that period of time, yeah, absolutely. And these traditions would have seemingly merged into the Theravada tradition, but it also raises the question, I think, for students, does it really matter? Does this claim to authority really, should it really concern us that much? Is Buddhism not more about the technique of liberation as opposed to the actual claims of authority over that particular technique? So, you know, it's not just about the original, but it's also about emergent traditions that come from that as well. So this whole question of orthodoxy is a tricky one. However, I think what Gombrich does recognise is that within the Theravadan milieu, there were ways of what one must do in order to achieve salvation, which was an individual solution, and then there was a more communal societal concern with how to go about living this life in a good life on a day-to-day basis. Now, as far as Gombrich is concerned, he suggests that the Buddha is not so much interested in the social ritual concerns, the wider world, the this world, the mundane. Gombrich is suggesting that the Theravada, from the way I read it, is much more concerned with personal salvation.
Yes.
And it's that personal salvation, individualistic personal salvation, which is the most important thing. The Buddha is not concerned with changing the world. The Buddha is concerned with changing the individual to bring them to that transformative experience of liberation. But it's interesting. You're mentioning these ideas of Theravada and the development of Theravada. Peter, where do you see Theravada, or when do you see, and where and how do you see Theravada actually becoming Theravada as we know it?
Great question. One of the classic texts of Theravada Buddhism is the Path of Purification, the Visuddhimagga, Magga meaning path, the path of purification. It's a 5th century text by this Buddhist author who is called Bodhichartra Buddhaghosa. So Buddhaghosa, for start, was this monk who had various tests. There's great stories about him. He wants to translate the Sinhalese Buddhist commentaries into Pali. Already there had been a great tradition of Buddhism that had grown up in Sri Lanka, and the writings of the Pali Canon have been canonized. And so he sets about writing commentaries, and he's written several commentaries. And then he sets about writing a summary of classical, as he thinks of it, orthodox Buddhism. Now, the Visuddhimagga has, is sometimes called the 7 purifications. It goes through, and this, I guess, follows the path, the assumptions of Theravada Buddhism. Begins, interestingly, with virtues. We don't normally associate virtues with Theravada Buddhism, but they're there. The importance of developing ethics. We have to, number one, purify our virtue. We have to purify our consciousness, and various elements of the consciousness are thought of in various ways of meditation and such, in terms of being purified. 3, we've got to purify our view. Very important in Theravada Buddhism, and there's a big section here. It includes things like the aggregates, the 5 aggregates. It includes in here and in the next section teaching on dependent origination. So section 4. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt? I mean, when you're talking about the purification of consciousness, I mean, one of the classic discussions between the Buddha and one of his monks was the monk was of the understanding that which comes after death is consciousness. That which transmigrates from one life to the next is consciousness. How much of a role does consciousness play in the Theravada tradition when it comes to purification? And certainly in relation to the realization that the Buddha came about, that actually it's the 5 aggregates which continue.
Well, here for Theravada, as with Mahayana, it would be wrong to see consciousness as a singular thing. And in the text, he describes the collection of consciousnesses: the eye gate, the ear gate, the nose gate, the mouth gate.
Okay.
These are sources of consciousness. We're getting deep into the Abhidhamma, his interpretation of the advanced teaching in the Pali Canon. Just to finish though, the other purifications: overcoming doubt, purification number 5 by knowledge, 6 by knowledge and vision of the way, and finally this purification involves the highest level, which is these 30, you mentioned consciousness, 37 states of consciousness. These are the advanced esoteric teachings of Theravada Buddhism. And I think this is interesting because this leaves the tradition quite elitist. Some people would criticize it. It's the Abhidhamma as an elite set of teachings for just monks, ordinary people. This is beyond them, it's argued.
Yeah.
These esoteric, there's levels of consciousness, levels of reality. What do you think about that? Is that a fair charge against Theravada Buddhism, that it's elitist and esoteric?
I think there are certain questions as to exactly how far it can take the individual, and that's something that I think we're going to be discussing in the Mahayana tradition later on. However, I would be very, very concerned as to questions of authority and the goal of a motivation, without a doubt. And I think Gombrich is in danger of actually homogenizing the Buddhist view to a wider audience.
As you could argue, so did Buddhaghosa, homogenized the Buddhism that came out of Sri Lanka.
And also conflating it with the idea of, or a singular idea of exactly what religion is. I mean, as Z. Smith has said, there are 50 definitions of religion, and none of them actually fit the bill. So again, there's that danger of Gombrich actually taking one specific understanding of what religion is in respect of Buddhism itself as a whole, as a homogenized mass, is problematic, and I think that's something that students do need to be aware of in their future.
And what we need to do is look at a contrasting perspective, the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism. Thank you very much.